Greetings and welcome to another lecture in comparative psychology. Now, in this lecture, I've basically gone beyond the book and I pulled out information that I could find about personalities found in various animal species. The first three are domesticated species, but it's always interesting to learn a little bit about the different personalities that have been studied in animals that we know. Starting with dogs. There's been a lot of research into dog personalities. A lot of people have come up with their own ideas of how best to measure a dog personality. But a lot of people seem to agree on the following: that these are all aspects of a dog's personality. Do realize that some of these seem to be sort of the polar opposites, so it's almost like they're on the same continuum. But they listed them separately, so I'm going to list them separately. The first is reactivity. And reactivity has to do, in a lot of ways, with that bold versus shy that we were talking about in the earlier videos. Are they neophobic? Do they approach something new, or do they run away from it? How bold are they? How outgoing are they? Sort of deals. There's also fearfulness, and fearfulness can be thought of, it's sort of the opposite of reactivity, but reactivity includes both ends of the spectrum there. Fearfulness is basically how frightened they are. It's possible to react to something novel without being frightened of it. You simply are kind of wary of it. And this goes off into the fearful part. They do indeed avoid novel situations, but they do so while showing, as far as we can tell anyway, signs of fear. Submissive body posture, shaking, sometimes whining, all of those deals that go along with dogs that are like, don't bother me, I'm not a threat. Also, general level of activity. There are very active dogs, there are less active dogs. It depends a lot on the breed, but it also depends on the individual as to how active or non-active they are, how much activity they need, how much activity they can get along with. Sociability. Sociability is how friendly are they? In humans, the big five, we might call that agreeableness. How friendly are they? There are very friendly dogs. There are dogs that are friendly to people, but not to other dogs. There are dogs that are not friendly to anyone or anything, with the possible exception of their owners. There are dogs that never met someone or something that they weren't their friend. It's a feature. Responsiveness to training. This is something that you're going to see with dogs that you might not see with other species, simply because dogs, pretty much started as a domesticated animal to help individuals hunt. At least that's what we think. Although they may also have started to basically clean up our garbage. That's the alternative theory that has come about lately. And that we just kind of started, adopting them because they got more submissive as they ate off our garbage, and we decided to put them to work as more than garbage disposals. But at any rate, how responsive to training are there? There are some dogs and there are some breeds that are very, very responsive to training. A lot of the herding breeds, a lot of the working breeds, very, very responsive to training. There are also breeds that are not responsive to training at all, some of the toy breeds, because they weren't bred to be responsive to training. They were bred to be companions. Some of the northern breeds, like Huskies and Malamutes and Shiba Inus and Akitas and stuff, they don't really go with training very well. Huskies don't do much for training. They do a lot for running. They like to run. But Huskies can be very difficult to train, for instance, in obedience. You don't see a lot of Huskies in obedience trials, simply because Huskies basically often have an idea that they're going to do what they want to do, and the heck with you. So they may score low on this. Doesn't mean they're not smart. It's just an aspect of their personality. Submissiveness. How submissive a dog is. How much is it likely to not want to be boss, to be willing to let someone else be boss. On the other hand, how aggressive it is. Aggressive can also go with dominant. They're not synonymous, but very often dogs are aggressive with one another. Dogs do have a hierarchy, dominance hierarchy, and so it can be necessary for dogs to be aggressive to work their way up or down. And so aggression is also thought of as being part of as dog personalities. When it comes to cats, I can hear you thinking now, a lot more variability in the research, not as much research. And there is a lot more variability here when we're talking about cats. Probably because cats in many ways are just as variable as dogs are in terms of a lot of the dog traits. There are very aggressive cats, very shy cats, very outgoing cats, very trainable cats. But the ones that I saw here, and I looked these up, these are fairly official. I got them from actual, research documents. The next slide I didn't, but this one I did, and the prior one I did as well. Can include neuroticism, which is basically emotional volatility. How stable are cats? And yeah, there are some stable cats, and there are some very unstable cats. Extroversion, how outgoing they are, how friendly they are. Okay, this is more like an adaptation of the Big Five. So we have extroversion, which is how outgoing they are, how much they like being with others. Dominance. Now we don't see in the Big Five, not for humans. Does the cat want to be the boss? Is the cat going to allow you to be the boss? Is it going to play the role of, the alpha, or is it going to play the role of a kitten that you get to be the boss of? Again, cats vary a lot on this particular dimension. Impulsiveness. How much do the cats seem to just act without thinking? How much do they plan? So it isn't necessarily emotional the way that neuroticism is. It's more simply, how much these cats sort of leap first and ask questions later, or whether they plan. I mean, I've played with cats, and some cats will just leap at, what you're playing with, whatever, and others will sit back and contemplate the best way to go in for the kill. And lastly, agreeableness. Agreeableness in humans, I have a tendency to phrase as how nice they are. And I suppose we could go that with this as well. How nice they are to you, how nice they are to others, whether they enjoy being petted, whether they are affectionate or not. That could all be part of agreeableness. Others look at this and say, no, maybe not. We got some other traits. So other traits that have been suggested include sociable, which I suppose could go along with agreeableness. It's a different way of talking about it. Dominant, which might go, again, with agreeableness, maybe with, we got dominance there. Curious, is curiosity a personality trait? Possibly, although a lot of cats are very, very curious. The next slide involves horses, and I got to tell you, with these personalities, I did not get them from a research paper. I got them from people who work with horses. So therefore, there's a great big caveat here, because they haven't necessarily been tested in any way. They're more anecdotal. They more have to do with people's experience with horses. But still, I figured I'd put them in. What the heck? And they can include things like social, how social the horses are. Do they like to be with other horses? Do they like to be by themselves? Do they like to be around people or not? How aloof they are. Now, aloof in some ways is the opposite of social. When you're aloof, you don't necessarily need people or quite possibly need other horses. Or is it that you, simply are more of a loner, or you do fine by yourself? That could also be aloof. So in a way, social and aloof are kind of ends of a spectrum, as are, quite frankly, fearful and challenging. At least, not as much. Fearful is self-explanatory. They're very neophobic, they're very shy, they're very afraid of everything. Challenging is it has aspects of outgoing, but challenging is also who's going to be the boss. And when dealing with horses, horses are very capable of letting humans know that the human is not the boss. Horses can buck, horses can run and ignore reins, horses can bite, horses can kick, horses can do all sorts of things if they want to be the head of the herd, because horses do that to each other. Horses are another one of those social animals that spend a lot of time, for instance, when they're young, chasing each other and biting each other and mock fighting each other, presumably because they're going to be doing that in the future. Both stallions and mares will fight. I mean, the mares have a hierarchy too. With stallions, it's more obvious, because in the wild, horses tend to live in smallish groups where there's usually one herd stallion, they're called, and any mares that he can keep, as well as the offspring. Usually females can stay. Male stallions don't tend to stay long enough to, herd stallion long enough to necessarily breed with their offspring. Herd stallions are probably like a year or two or maybe 3, and then they're out. But definitely younger males, as soon as they start reaching sexual maturity, they're about a year or so old, they get kicked out, and then they have to go and find their own moms. And so stallions, of course, are going to be very challenging because they're going to need this later in order to get their own group of mares with whom they can pass their genes down. This last diagram I got from a personality text. And it looks at a number of different animal species in terms of the classic human big five: neuroticism, extroversion, agreeableness, openness to experience, and conscientiousness. And they looked at a number of studies, this is a meta-analysis, and they figured out they tried to figure out anyway, whether or not these species of animals show aspects of these big five personality characteristics. And you see the X's for those that did. Some of these are not overly surprising. Primates tend to show 4 or 5 of these. So do dogs and cats, quite possibly because we've bred them to, particularly dogs. Notice that rhesus monkeys, dogs, and cats don't have conscientiousness. Conscientiousness I tend to describe as responsibility, and they aren't very responsible for much of anything. Chimps are. Chimps worry about their colleagues and that sort of thing. Rhesus monkeys and dogs and cats not as much. Hyenas, for instance, don't have extroversion, but they have neuroticism, that emotional volatility. They have agreeableness. They have openness to experience. Pigs have those two, plus agreeableness. Pigs can be very nice animals. Vervet monkeys have extroversion and agreeableness. Donkeys have agreeableness and openness. Rats have neuroticism and agreeableness. It's really kind of interesting to look at these. Guppies have a personality. Guppies. Or at least someone said that they did, appeared to find traits that they did. Then again, we could look at this also along that boldness-shyness continuum, where we were talking about the pumpkin seed sunfish. Guppies may not be that different. Octopi, well, if any invertebrate's going to have a personality, it's going to be an octopus. It's going to be the cephalopods. Simply because they seem to have the largest brain and certainly the most variable behavior. And then we have one little bird there, the chickadee. Chickadees tend to have openness to experience. Again, that's probably that bold, shy continuum that we were talking about. So it does appear that animals do have personalities, and that they may indeed develop these personalities and show these personalities in much the same way that human beings do.